Okay, round two. Hopefully you guys can hear us this time.
Hopefully.
Sorry about that. I had a little bit of a mix-up in some settings. Had a bit of a system update that kind of threw me off a little bit. Was not expecting that, so apologies once again. But anyway, welcome to yet another live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, joined here for the second time in the past 5 minutes by now game director Ion Hazzikostas. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here again. Can't wait to answer a bunch of exciting questions. And I just want to thank everybody. This is probably going to be way less sincere the second time around when you couldn't hear me the first time around. But just want to thank everybody for all the kind words and support over the last day since the announcement. It's an honor, and it's kind of mind-blowing to think, 12 years ago when I sat down to first check out this game, that the crazy meandering path of life would lead me to this. It's an incredible honor to be the caretaker of this legacy and to work alongside just the best team in the business. And I hope I can do right by everyone. I haven't screwed it up and broken things for one day, so hopefully try to keep that track record going.
Yeah, I honestly I just have to take the opportunity to say, having been able to work with Ian so much and have so many conversations with you over the past couple of years that I've been here. It's really been great to see the sort of the passion and the strength that you really bring to the game.
Thank you so much.
I honestly think that the game's in really, really good hands. So I'm very excited for what the future holds.
Me too. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, speaking of what the future holds, we should probably get into some of these questions here today. So we'll go ahead and start with this one from Ralos, who asked, are you and the team happy with where classes have ended up after the initial balance tuning pass? And can we expect to see more before 7.1?
Okay, so yes, obviously class balance and tuning is always a hot topic across the entire community. We're happier than where they were before the balance tuning pass. We know there's more work still to do. And tuning, one of the challenges is that it encompasses so many different settings. Of course, we have PvP tuning, where a bunch of hotfixes just went out over the last 24 hours. For tuning, some people are concerned primarily with their raid performance. Others are looking to get into Mythic and Mythic Plus dungeon groups. And so there's a lot of moving pieces there, and we have more work to do. I think we see it as an ongoing process that will probably never be complete. So it's likely there'll be more tweaks before 7.1. It's likely there'll be more tweaks after 7.1. One of the challenges, and clearly, there are some specializations on the low end that are getting buffs in 7.1, which we feel are needed to help make them more competitive. But one of the challenges that we run into is that it's such a moving target that the actual numbers that people are looking at and using to gauge balance are a reflection of actual people playing the game. They're not a reflection of a simulation or theoretical performance. And we found that there's a large portion of the community that ultimately is looking to play whatever currently seems like the strongest thing. And those are also the same people who are generally min-maxing. They're the ones who are gemming and enchanting all of their stuff, who are pre-potting, who are optimizing their rotations, who are trying to play at the cutting edge. And so whichever spec is currently home to most of those people or more of those people is going to also kind of get a natural bump in the results. So when we look at a spec like Frostmage, for example, they are way better than what the numbers, if you just look at Warcraft logs, would suggest in terms of their potential, what they can actually do. It's just that a large number of the min-maxing mages are playing Fire right now. And so there aren't as many of those people who are really trying to push the envelope. Now, that's not to say Frost and Fire are equal and the balance is perfect, but it does speak a little bit to why we tend to be a bit conservative with these changes, because we've seen in the past it doesn't take much to cause a drastic change. If we buff Frost incrementally to the point where they're now actually the hands-down best mage spec, suddenly people who invested a lot of their time and effort in building up their Fire artifact, their Fire gear, Fire legendaries, etc., are going to be upset. But B, what we might start to see is suddenly there's this large swing where Fire dips, Frost surges ahead, just based on player behavior and not any change that we made. It's something we've seen multiple times in the past, where Spec B is a little bit behind Spec A, we buff Spec B, and then if you look at the numbers and actual representation, Spec A drops in their performance a week or 3 weeks later, as if we'd nerfed them even though we'd done nothing. So we're trying to maintain stability and avoid, things going out of equilibrium, but it's, like I said, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of speak to that a little bit, it's It's funny you were talking about mages because I've been playing a mage, but I've been playing arcane, and I've had parses through like log sites like Warcraft logs and so on, where I have parsed in the top 10 for arcane mages. I'm bad at this game. I want to be honest about that. I'm not very good at this. So when I can parse in the top 10, like imagine if you took all the best mages and had them playing arcane or had them all playing frost, things would look very differently. So that makes a lot of sense. But it is good to hear that we're looking into doing some additional. Well, obviously there's tuning happening in 7.1. So
yeah,
cool. Let's move on. Next question here comes from JRB on Twitter, who asked, what can be done to make Hunter Barrage less annoying, e.g. pulling mobs directly above you? Otherwise, great talent, but too random.
Yes. I think everyone who's been running dungeons for the past 6 weeks or so has probably had that fun experience of like, where did that seagull come from? Yeah. Or I didn't even know those mobs were there, and now they're punching me in the face. Yes. We would like to make Barrage feel more consistent and reliable, especially when it comes to Z-axis and things far above you. One of the challenges there, though, is also making sure that if you're standing at the top of a hill or a staircase and fighting things below you, that it feels like you should be able to barrage towards, that you are able to hit them with Barrage. We may actually end up making the spell shaped as kind of an odd half cut-off cone, because it's very common to want to shoot down, much less common to want to shoot very high up in the air. We'll have to see how that plays out. The other big concern here is ultimately one of talent balance. It's that even in situations where Barrage feels inconvenient to use or comes with a lot of risks and downsides, it just feels like the all-around best choice in the row. The same can be said for Sidewinders for marks. And ideally, if you don't want to deal with the hassle of managing Barrage and having to always run into melee range and turn back around to the place that's been cleared behind you and so forth, then you should be able to just pick another talent in that row. But too often right now it feels like those aren't competitive. So that's another way we can tackle this.
Yeah, so like there should be an option to say this is not the dungeon that I want to use Barrage in because the mobs are too close together, so I'll pick one of the other ones. But right now, Barrage just feels too good.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Makes sense. Let's move on. Next question from No Virtue. This was a question we got a lot of people asking, who asked, what can be done to curb the heavy RNG element in regards to legendaries that's the cause of a lot of frustration? And there's actually a lot of confusion around how legendaries work as well, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point in this Q&A. But the RNG side of legendaries, what's going on there?
They are a fundamentally random system, and I think the flip side of that frustration is also often excitement when they drop, and the moments of excitement in whether it's in guild chat, among friends, among personal reactions. I've seen, streams, videos. There's a lot of excitement that can happen there that you would not have in a completely predictable, deterministic way of obtaining them. I realize, obviously, it can be super frustrating, and there are some systems in place to prevent extreme bad luck from occurring. But when we look at this, so I guess taking a large step back at the design to look at the design of the system, as a whole. Question one, should there be interesting, exciting, really powerful items in the game? Should every item just be primary stat, secondary stat, and nothing else? Some people might say yes, they want the game to be 100% skill-based. They don't really care about the gear side of it. We feel that as an MMO and as an RPG, part of that means character progression, power, and your items, especially once you've hit max level, being able to somehow influence your gameplay. So we opted for introducing powerful items, and this is nothing new. We've had legendaries and such game-changing items throughout the game's history. So then there's a few different ways that they could be obtained. They could be, something that's on a vendor. They could cost a currency. It could just be, this legendary costs 10,000 whatever points, and every time you run a dungeon, every time you kill a raid boss, you get some points. I think that would feel, if you look at this, you'd say this is powerful, this is almost mandatory to have. That feels like a huge grind. It feels in that world like you are just slowly crawling your way towards, an eventual goal. There's no excitement when you finally get there. It's more relief when you finally get there. Other systems that we've had in the past have certainly been random, or they've been some mix of you need to collect 50 drops that are random but not super random. They're 40% type of drops. Ultimately, we see legendaries as the direct complement in a lot of ways to artifact power. Artifact power is when you go out and you run a dungeon, you do a raid, you queue for a battleground, whatever. You might not get an item reward. You might not get a crazy upgrade, the peak of which is going to be legendary, but you're always going to be making progress in terms of making your character stronger. So I think that's kind of how we've approached constructing the system. Obviously, there's frustration to wanting this thing and not getting it. That's the case whether you're chasing after a rare mount, whether you're chasing after anything. And I say this as someone who's played a large amount of Legion since the game's come out and does not have a legendary myself.
Yeah. Me either.
But I'm due now, any day. Just every time I open those emissary caches, I'm like, all right, here's my legendary. No, sorry, no legendary. But
I didn't get one for my birthday, so thanks a lot.
I'm sorry.
All right, cool. Let's move on to the next question, which is also about legendaries. We can sort of continue this going here. Question comes from Irani on Twitter, who asked, what are your plans with legendaries for people who haven't gotten one or have gotten one notably subpar for their class?
Well, I think if you haven't gotten one, just keep playing the game, keep killing bosses, keep doing BGs, keep doing your world quests. It'll happen. But the flip side of that is also maybe on your birthday we can just mail one to you. But the flip side of that is, obviously there's some people who are hoping for, they're hoping for Fire Mage bracers and they get the Absorb neck. And they think to themselves, man, this would be crazy. I really wanted the crazy DPS upgrade. This isn't the dream legendary for me. Well, you'll keep getting more is the first answer. Second answer, I think, is a lot of the ones that fall in the utility range, a lot of people kind of discount because their value isn't as immediately apparent as a rotation transforming or straight damage increase that you're going to feel right away. But increasingly, you do start to come across situations where those things are very valuable. Being able to live through large AoE bursts when you're doing high-end Mythic dungeons, or raid damage on a fight like Ursoc, or just having options available to you. When you have a Warlock in your raid who has the legendary pants that let them drop Demonic Gateway instantly, that actually can open up some strategic tactical options that make the Warlock feel cool and special, and make everyone really grateful for the Warlock's presence and the fact that they have and are using that legendary. In the long run, as you have more legendaries to choose from, and you're deciding which ones to equip based on the limit that you have set, that will actually be more tools in your toolkit that you can use to customize your character for a given situation. All of that said, there are some that just aren't as good as we would have liked. There are some that particularly probably feel disappointing for certain specs or roles. Like if you're a tank demon hunter or monk and you get the leather legendary that increases your damage done to high health targets, you're probably raising an eyebrow wondering like, wait, what is that, a bug? Isn't that a DPS legendary?
Right.
And we have plans in the not too distant future to either buff or in some cases redesign some of those. Like for example, if that legendary I just mentioned, instead of just being a straight damage add-on, instead provided that damage in a form that was also lifesteal. So when you're fighting high health targets, you're proccing extra damage, but you're also healing for that amount. Well, okay, cool. Now suddenly there's some interesting gameplay there where you can turn and heal yourself off of ads. It's giving you some survivability. Is it your best in slot legend?
Okay, apparently it is technical difficulties day here in our streaming room, so I apologize for that. Hopefully we're back now. Hopefully everybody can see us again, and hopefully this stops happening. That would be really great.
That would be fantastic.
Knock on wood.
Yeah, computers.
That would be excellent if we could stop having these issues. But getting back into what you were saying, you were talking about legendaries and specifically giving the idea of talking about that leather legendary.
Yes. So I'm trying to figure out exactly where we were when the stream crashed. I think we were mainly talking about. So yes, there's some legendaries are undervalued. Some are actually probably worse than we want them to be. I think I gave the example of leather bonus damage on high health targets legendary that tanks could get. Ones like those, I think we're going to look at buffing / redesigning in some cases slightly. So that tank legendary that I just mentioned, for example, could also steal health from high health targets to heal you, as well as just doing extra damage, so that it has value both for damage dealers and tanks. We don't want it to feel like something is literally worthless. Similarly, the damage absorbed neck often feels not great for tanks because you're constantly getting hit, and one of the preconditions for it triggering is not taking damage for a while. There are changes we can make to make sure that if you feel like you've got a weaker legendary, well, they're not as weak as you might think they are. There's always going to be a best, there's always going to be a worst. That's the case whenever there's a list of different options. but we will make sure that the worst ones aren't as bad as they currently are.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds good. Like you say, it is a little bit disappointing when you get that one that isn't exactly ideal. But also, like you were saying earlier, a lot of them, maybe they're not that huge immediate DPS upgrade, but there are like good reasons to have them as well. Moving on, question here from the Nakagara, I think I said that right, on Twitter, who asked, is the current design of hardcore for casual players and casual for hardcore players intended Mythic cleared day one? So I don't entirely get what the first part of that is alluding to, but talking about how like the Mythic raid was cleared pretty quickly.
Sure. I mean, I guess, yes, for the top guilds in the world, they cleared Mythic Emerald Nightmare relatively quickly. I'm not sure I would describe anything about the process that they used to approach that as casual. So I think a couple of things there. First off, I think Xavius on Mythic difficulty was definitely not tuned to the level that we would have wanted. I think that's probably the one regret in the entirety of the raid zone and tuning. Other than that, there's a really nice steady ramp and progression in difficulty, from Nethendra all the way up through Il'gynoth and Cenarius. And then Xavius does feel like a little bit of a step down. On normal and heroic, I think the difficulty in relative terms is much more appropriate, but we dropped the ball on the Mythic tuning. Not gonna defend that there. And in an ideal world, that probably would have been more like an 2-day boss, 80 to 100 attempts for the top guilds. That said, we weren't trying to make any Manaroth or Archimonds like 300 attempt walls in this raid zone. This is the first raid tier of an expansion with lots more to come. We've got Trial of Valor coming soon. We've got the Nighthold after that, and more to follow. This is an introduction to raiding. There are still only a few dozen guilds who have made their way through the whole zone, and there are plenty of people having a good time and progressing at a steady rate, which I think is entirely appropriate for what we're seeing. The very, very top guilds also, they're doing things that are not really representative of the vast majority of the game, and it's very dangerous for us to fall into the trap of designing for guilds that are doing, 4 or 5 character split clears the first week, that are spending most waking hours outside of that running Mythic Keystone dungeons, etc. The item level that they went into the first raid with, or into that first Mythic week with, is an item level that quote-unquote average Mythic guilds, if there's even such a thing as an average Mythic guild, since no Mythic guild is anything but exceptional, an item level that they're reaching just now in week 3 or week 4 of Mythic. And so to design a fight that would feel out of reach for folks going in with that item level, I think would create a frustrating experience for others. Those are separate problems. I think in the longer run, we'd love to find ways to disincentivize or curb the split farming and behaviors that I think the guilds in that elite group don't necessarily enjoy themselves, but feel obligated to do in order to stay competitive. But we want to, again, do that without imposing restrictions on the average player who might, for perfectly reasonable reasons, want to run a raid on a couple different characters or want to be able to share loot around. So we'll see.
Okay. Sounds good. Let's go ahead and move on. Question here from Highstone, who asked, what is the design intent behind Protection Warriors, and why was the Rage from Damage Taken model brought back?
The design intent for Protection Warriors is for them to be obviously mix of tanky and mobile with, things like Heroic Leap, Intercept, etc., letting them get around the play space. Rage from Damage Taken, some of it was a throwback to just the old school warrior days, the concept of, getting punched makes you angry. You use your anger to fuel your tankiness and your abilities. But in some ways, it was a replacement for what was a couple of expansions ago, Vengeance, and last expansion, Resolve. This idea that, it's important that your tankiness scale in some form with the content that you're doing. And that, in order for a button like Ignore Pain to be in any way relevant when you're tanking a Mythic raid boss, it, without any other modification, if you could use it just as much when you're doing a normal mode dungeon, that would make you completely unkillable and invincible in the normal mode dungeon. So by scaling rage based on damage intake, the warrior in a Mythic raid can push Ignore Pain way more. They have nearly infinite rage. The one who's soloing or doing lower end content has to manage the rage a bit more, but they still achieve equal measures of survivability relative to the content that they're doing.
Okay, makes sense. Let's move on. A question here from It's Theed, who asked, will the level 100 Shadow Priest talent redesign be in 7.1 or later? So I believe earlier you were speaking on, I think it was on the forums, you were talking about how not entirely happy with that level 100 talent.
Yeah, I think this was actually probably on Twitter in response to this very question that was tweeted to me. But yeah, so just to elaborate outside of the confines of 140 characters, not in 7.1, but hopefully not too long after that. It's something that we know that we need to do right, and it's not an easy thing. There's some problems with Surrender to Madness right now. It's definitely, it kind of pigeonholes Shadow Priest into a specific playstyle. It can be frustrating to use in certain situations, and it was designed to be a very high-risk, high-reward, really flavorful talent, but it feels like it's kind of come to dominate the class's viability in a lot of PvE and especially raiding endgame. And when we tinkered a little bit with trying to fix some of the problems there, we quickly realized that we were creating a whole new host of problems because in many ways that their viability hinges on that talent more than we would like. So we'd like to offer other robust alternatives that are equally powerful for people who don't want to use Surrender to Madness, don't like needing to be resurrected after every dungeon boss or what have you, or just are looking for a different playstyle, but we need to do that right. We need to iterate on that, get feedback from it in a lengthier PTR environment. So it's something we want to do, but in the meantime, I think Shadow Priests actually are in a pretty solid place if they are willing to embrace that Surrender to Madness playstyle for the time being. They're pretty strong all around, and we don't plan on touching that until we can do it right.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Like, I love Surrender to Madness. I was playing Shadow Priest a bunch in the pre-patch, and I've started leveling my priest as well now, and it's really, really fun to use for me, but I can understand why if you don't want to be the guy who dies on every single encounter, especially if you're doing like Mythic Keystone dungeons,
yes,
where it actually costs you a little
Not
bit
anymore.
of time.
We hotfixed that 3 days ago.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, because the 5-second Mythic Keystone penalty was there to kind of slightly punish sloppy play, make sure you weren't intentionally suiciding to skip packs or to take shortcuts. But it's not really in your control. So penalizing your group for surrender deaths felt kind of unfair.
So it's just surrender deaths. They don't count against the...
Surrender deaths don't give you a 5-second penalty.
Awesome. That's good to know. Moving on then. Next question here from Shaping Us on Twitter, who asked, will secondary stat values be tuned? Feel like item levels are now, in most cases, nothing but a budgeting portrayal. So sort of talking about how a lot of classes right now are sort of feeling like, well, that's a 30 item level upgrade, but it doesn't have crit, so I don't want it.
This is actually my list of regrets from a design perspective with how Legion has turned out so far is actually shockingly short. There aren't a ton of things that we would do differently. I think if we could go back 2 months, maybe that answer will be different a few months from now.
Right.
But the way primary and secondary stats have played out is one of those regrets. We know we have work to do here on 2 fronts. First off, there are some really large disparities between the values of secondary stats for some specializations. It's fine to have a best, it's fine to have a worst. It's less fine when you're looking at items that don't have your one favorite stat or have your least favorite stat on them as worthless. And that's something we plan on continuing to improve, but we need to do carefully, and we want to give a lot of advance notice when we do it, because that can potentially change gearing decisions. The last thing we want, even as we're pursuing a more balanced state, is for someone to suddenly feel like half the items that they're wearing or the choices they've made in enchanting their gear or selecting items are now invalid. That's not great. And then separately, there's the relative valuation of primary and secondary stats. Due to some other changes we've made to the overall tuning and balancing of the game, I think at no point in the game's history have primary stats been less valuable in relation to secondary stats. Part of that is because we did some things aimed at narrowing the band the players operate in with regard to their amount of crit or haste, such that you wouldn't feel like you had terribly low crit or haste values at low gear levels, while at the same time not climbing to incredibly high soft crit cap type levels towards the end of an expansion. But what that's meant is that early on, because we're front-loading secondary stats more on items in a lot of ways, the secondary stats carry much more weight. Some of that problem will fix itself naturally as item levels increase and we get later into the expansion. But really, our design intent is, and where we'd like to end up is, for the most part, to have item level be what determines upgrades. It's definitely a failure right now that we have a system in personal loot, for example, of tradability and determining what is and isn't an upgrade that's based on item level, when often, especially with jewelry, players are finding that steers them the wrong way. We have work to do here, and that's on us to do, and it's something that we're going to continue to work on over the course of the expansion. But we want to make sure that we're making any of these changes in a way that gives players the maximum amount of advance notice.
Yeah, if crit goes from being your best stat by a massive amount to it's kind of okay, and then even if it's still your best stat, but you were turning down upgrades from raids or handing them off to somebody else.
Exactly that.
That would feel pretty bad. Cool, makes sense. Moving on, question here from Drakasanath, I think, on Twitter, who asked, is there any chance of reducing the crafting material requirement to alleviate the very onerous cost of optimizing for raids before 7.1? So talking about like how much do potions cost, how much do enchants cost, and so on.
Yeah, so I think this is definitely something that's on our radar. We're taking a very close look at. I think we want to see how the Blood of Sargeras trader plays out in 7.1, along with some new recipes like the Blood of Sargeras-based DPS potion that lasts 60 seconds and can be made pretty efficiently with Blood of Sargeras, also giving an outlet for alchemists who have them. I think that once 7.1 comes out, we're going to see a huge volume of resources dumped onto the market as people who have been accumulating hundreds of Bloods of Sargeras now have a way to turn those into gold and consumables. That said, I think it's still going to feel, and probably will end up feeling, certainly more expensive and more onerous, if you want to describe it that way, than it did in Warlords. I think we feel in retrospect, in Warlords, consumables and professions, and gathering especially, didn't have enough value to them. At no point in the game's history prior to Warlords were things like flasks and DPS potions as cheap and as plentiful as they were in Warlords, where everyone had a garden in their own garrison and you could just go get herbs. And some of that we saw people abandon their gathering professions. And part of what we're seeing now is a lack of supply because people had shifted away from gathering. But even over the last couple of weeks, we've seen large increases in the amount of supply because there's a clear, very high demand for things like Starlight Rose and other key materials. And that's part of actually a healthy player economy. There's a lot of gold to be made right now via gathering, and that's part of the traditional loop of spending consumables that distributes money out into the economy, which then can be fed back into raid guilds via other means. Also, that said, I think we're seeing it's taken some time in some cases. There's also an adjustment in psychology for how to approach consumables, and this is something that's, I think, on the shoulders of raid leaders in some cases. Because of how plentiful they were and how cheap they were throughout Warlords, many guilds settled into this culture of just an expectation. Well, yeah, you pre-pot on every pull. Doesn't matter if this is just progress. Doesn't matter if this is farm and we've been killing this forever. This is just what you do. You have to always be flasked, and those are considered signs of being ready for raiding and being prepared. And I think those assumptions are being re-examined now. I don't think it always was that way in the past. It certainly wasn't that way years and years ago. It was just that in Warlords, that became the norm because of how affordable they were. When you're doing your very first pull on a new boss, trying to figure out the proper strategy, is that DPS potion really going to make the difference between much of anything? Now, in some cases, if you're trying to see a transition or make it cleanly out of Phase 1 to see Phase 2, it may, but far more often, it's not. And so I think a lot of these consumables were designed as luxuries to be used for special occasions, to be used when their value is going to be maximized, not just 100% uptime, thoughtless things that you just do mechanically. And we're seeing them somewhat shift towards that space. Obviously, for cutting-edge Mythic guilds, that's a different story. Yeah. But those guilds are the minority.
Yeah, so to an extent, there's always going to be those guilds, like you say, the cutting-edge Mythic guilds that are always going to be going for everything that they possibly can get. Maybe for other guilds, like the more average guilds, like my group, we actually use the engineering food, the Reeves snack table.
Sure.
It's robot food. I don't know how that works entirely, but it's delicious. It gives me 275 versatility. That's fine. We use flasks. We don't use potions. Like, that's the sort of way that we've sort of fallen into things. Maybe that's something that more guilds need to start looking into. But also, I think that having that Blood of Sargeras.
Yeah, exactly. And just to be clear, the answer isn't no, consumable costs are fine, just use them less. There's multiple facets to the answer. I think Consumable costs are probably right now the highest they will ever be throughout the expansion. They're going to do nothing but decline over time as more sources of consumables come into the market and as supply continues to increase.
Okay, cool. And it's something that we're keeping an eye on.
Yes,
So.
and I think that's our intent and our desire. If it looks like a month from now, wow, they're still unaffordably expensive, then at that point we probably would look at things like the crafting material requirements to make things like flasks and potions. But right now we feel like we're still in a period of overall adjustment, both in terms of player psychology and behavior and just the economy in general. And so we don't want to jump the gun on a change that may end up being an overcorrection in the long run.
Yeah, we don't want to get back to them being like super cheap and almost worthless to even make.
It's awesome having Gathering really be valuable again.
Cool. All right, moving on. Question here from I think I'm going to pronounce this "See-You Roar" just because it makes me chuckle a little bit. He asked, with Mythic Plus being a huge part of Legion, are there any plans to help specs that don't have strong, consistent, wow, there's a typo there that I missed, I apologize, AoE, so they can partake in higher keystones?
So a little bit, but not honestly, not entirely. I think if what this question is asking is, can all specs have strong, consistent AoE? The answer is no. Because again, we want there to be areas of strength and weakness, and for every demon hunter who can go in and melt something, we want the feral druid who can do single target DPS like no other. I think it's actually interesting because in some ways the consistent AoE is most emphasized as an attribute in quick farming clearing runs. It was something we were seeing a lot in Mythic runs before raids opened, and I think if you're trying to do like 2 chest, 3 chest speed runs of lower difficulties, then that is probably what you want, and that's going to be something that's more advantageous for some specs than others. But look, if you think Shadow Priest, for example, Shadow Priests are probably not the spec that would come to mind when you think strong, consistent AoE. Even after the Mindseer buff, it's just not a strength of theirs.
Right.
I just recently saw there's a video on YouTube of a plus 15 keystone clear with a Shadow Priest in the group doing phenomenally well. Because actually, when you're getting into higher keystones, especially as you get to plus 10 with things like Fortified and Tyrannical in play, you're not clearing anything quickly. With Fortified, especially with affixes like Raging that make just mindless blanket AoE a terrible idea, you're doing much more single target. You are getting a chance to apply dots to let things rot away for a good chunk of time as you're kiting away from Necrotic, as you're carefully managing bolstering or Raging, or certainly as you're fighting a 4-minute boss on Tyrannical. And so we'd rather use dungeons and tweak dungeons and the keystone affixes in the future in ways that play into the different strengths that specs have, than just try to homogenize and normalize those strengths and weaknesses away. Some of that, and some of this is also, and one of the challenges here, which I recognize, is it's about community perception. It doesn't matter if you're actually good if the community perceives that your spec is bad, and then when you apply to groups, they say, sorry, not looking for an X, we only want Marks Hunter or whatever.
Right.
And that's something that we definitely, it's a challenge for all of us. We continue to work towards trying to improve visibility and perception and think about what types of changes and discussions we need to have in order to broaden awareness of how viable the specs actually are. And that's something that's an ongoing topic of discussion, but we recognize that it's a huge factor here in player experience.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue, like to really sort of start to think about, because there are a lot of Shadow Priests out there who are like, no, we're really good. I'm really good. I should be getting into this. Like, there's arcane mages, there's elemental shamans.
Yeah, I was reading a thread on MMO Champion, I want to say a couple weeks ago, that was specifically like, I forgot, the title was something, and I'm paraphrasing loosely here, like, please stop thinking elemental shamans are bad for Mythic Keystone dungeons, because they're really not. Like with their toolkit of Chain Lightning and Earthquake, especially with the proc stuns from Earthquake, they have really excellent both control and AoE damage, as well as solid single target burst through things like Ascendance when needed. They're very versatile, but I think because they were a little bit underpowered at the start of the expansion before we had some buffs roll out, there's this perception of, oh, well, I'll just go with the Fire Mage instead. But give shamans a try. You'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Let's move on. Excuse me. Next question comes from Olivia Grace, actually. Surprise, surprise. Good question from Olivia Gray. No one would ever have expected that.
I'm shocked.
Yeah. She asked, could rewards from world quests, not caches, adjust according to loot spec? Would be really nice for focused gearing.
Okay, so there's two reasons why it doesn't work this way. And we've definitely heard the feedback, and at times, especially for pure DPS, it can feel like a bug. Because if you're a mage, all your trinkets that you see are int regardless, and so sometimes you're a fire mage and you'll see a frost relic on your map, and you'll be like, wait, what? Why is the game giving me that? Hybrids are more accustomed to seeing, a druid will see agi trinkets and int trinkets with equal measure. Sometimes you'll see a healing specific trinket that has a healer proc. The reasons why we went with class-based loot as opposed to spec-based loot for world quests are twofold. First off, if the map changed every time you changed spec, that would actually be a potentially very annoying player experience. If you logged in, you wanted to see what cool world quests were up, what cool rewards they had, and you felt like the right thing to do was to cycle between your different specs to see, oh wow, okay, that has an awesome trinket that I'm looking for. I'm going to go do that in this spec as opposed to this other spec. But separately, I think it actually also serves as a way for people to get gear for their off specs in a safer way. If you don't want to change your loot spec in a world of Titan Forging and legendaries, you could always get that crazy upgrade for your main spec, even if you're doing content that you somewhat outgear. There's a lot of value to being able to look at the map, use world quests to get those off-spec relics, to get those off-spec trinkets, to kind of keep those off-specs up to speed. And in some cases, it encourages people and gives them the freedom to try out specs they never would have. Because, well, I mostly play Resto, but I keep seeing these Iron and Flame relics on my map, and I've put them in my Doomhammer that I collected in my inventory. So, well, let me actually give this spec a try. Maybe it's more fun than I thought it would be. And it's much less likely that someone goes down that road, I think, if you need to actively change your spec to something you have no gear for and start collecting that gear. Some might do it purposely, but it's much less likely to lead to that experimental discovery.
Okay. Cool. Let's move on then. Question here from Sinair, who said, how does the bad luck protection for legendaries work? Right now, I feel like the system is time-based only. Does it reward player activity? We've seen a lot of people. I kind of mentioned earlier on that there's been a lot of confusion about how legendaries work. And we've seen a lot of people sort of assuming that it's just time-based. But correct me if I'm wrong, it's actually not at all.
Yes,
right?
okay. So there's no time component to it. It is mostly, honestly, it's mostly just random. If you get a legendary, you got lucky to get that legendary. If you log off and put your character in ice for a month, you're not going to be any more likely or luckier when it comes to getting a legendary when you come back. It's just the more things you do that could give you a legendary, the more likely you are to get a legendary. And that's kind of what it boils down to. Now, in some ways, we're very confident. There was one initial bug that slightly skewed the distribution of people who already had one legendary.
Yeah.
But the actual effects we're talking about, it was a single-digit percentage of people who got their first legendary that were affected by this. Not very widespread at all. We've fixed it. Every single other case the players have presented where something seems suspicious, we've investigated thoroughly, and there's never been anything awry there. We have kind of joke around the office. We almost should have implemented good luck protection for legendaries in terms of improving perception of the system. Because the reality is, when you have random events that are actually just random and millions of people participating in the game, things that are phenomenally unlikely are going to happen. And those things are going to end up on forums, on Reddit, elsewhere. And it creates this perception of, well, this guy in my guild got 3 legendaries in one day. Yes, if the system's actually random, if millions of people are doing things and killing millions of bosses, there are going to be people who get 3 legendaries in one day. It's the same as, that person kind of could have won a lottery with that luck. But, of course, that drives the perception of, something's broken because you're seeing those outliers. You're not seeing I got 1 legendary, and then I didn't see any more for a while. And then I got another, which is the actual average experience. Or I got no legendaries, then eventually I got 1. That's also kind of within that broad average.
Right.
But that's not what we're fixating on as a community when we're trying to figure out how the system's working. Ultimately, the answer is play the game and do your emissary caches, kill bosses, do PvP, and they will come.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting too. Like I was actually hanging out in Towley's chat room yesterday, and he was talking about. He's like, "How many legendaries do you have, Lore?" And I was like, 0, sad tear face. And he's like, "Oh, I've got 4. That's fine." But I was thinking about that later. I'm like, it's actually kind of his job to play World of Warcraft all the time, and so he's playing that game more than probably anybody right
Also,
now.
having 4 puts him in the like top 0.01% or something of players. That is phenomenally uncommon.
Yeah.
And he's very lucky.
So next time we need to add anti-Towley protection just to make sure that doesn't
Agreed.
happen again. All right, question here from Mr. Rousseau on Twitter, who asked, when will the action cam come back? I loved the extra immersion it brought to the game.
7.1. You can hop on the PTR right now, /console action cam full, and it will bring all those features back. It's something that will actually disable itself every time you log back into the game. So you'll want to make a macro or something to re-enable it if that's the way you want to play. We wanted to make sure to take the safeguards that needed to be put in place to make sure it wasn't accidentally enabling itself the way we were seeing at the start of the expansion, which is what led to us disabling it in the first place.
Right.
It's super fun feature. It's optional. We don't view it as kind of a mainstream supported feature that we're advertising in our patch notes, but it's something that content creators are going to have a lot of fun with. Mod makers can hook into in various ways, and we're looking forward to seeing what the community ends up doing with it.
So a lot of people were asking about the add-ons as well. The add-ons that were working with the action cam before, those will work once again in 7.1. Excellent. Great. That is good news. Question here from Unray, who asked, will there be any punishment for leaving Mythic Plus dungeon runs?
This is really tricky. In practice, obviously, having someone drop out of your Mythic Keystone run halfway through, leaving you unable to finish the run, is an incredibly frustrating experience.
Yeah.
That said, we can't really think of alternatives that don't invite more serious abuse in other ways. Whether that's the ability to swap in extra people once a run is almost complete,
right,
to sell people, to sell runs, to do whatever, or whether that's if you can swap in extra people, what stops the group leader from kicking people out and bringing his friends in to finish the run? That would be an even worse experience. Or if there were ways of undepleting your keystone or restoring it to its original state when someone dropped, well, why would you not just Alt F4 anytime something's going wrong with the run and it looks like you're not going to make the timer? And of course, no one wants a depleted keystone.
Right.
So with the current system, I think, obviously, the best protection against this is to run them with friends and to find people that you know and trust, whether that's meeting good tanks and healers and DPS through the group finder, adding them to your friends list and looking them up when you want to do runs, or doing it with real-life friends or guildmates. I'd also encourage people to take a second to talk to your group before the run starts to make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of the goals that run has. If someone is only there if you can get 2 or more chests and plans on dropping the second it looks like you're not going to, you should determine that up front before you actually put your keystone in to start the run. But at the end of the day, and I think as we're seeing, especially through the pre-made group finder, keystones are plentiful. And even if your run and your keystone ends up, going to waste because of something unfortunate that happens, there are others out there and other groups that you can join. It's very difficult to imagine what any kind of formal punishment in this sort of case would be for pre-made groups. And sometimes someone's internet legitimately goes out. Sometimes, an emergency comes up and there are things beyond someone's control. And that's the last thing we want to do when it comes to punishing people for things like that.
Yeah. So obviously not a completely ideal situation, but it's a difficult issue to actually solve.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Moving on, next question from Star Mike on Twitter, who asked, will there be a system in place where we can move all artifact power to another weapon? Can't even properly test other specs now.
I think we have no plans to do that, but the way artifact knowledge scaling works in comparison to the cost of traits in the various weapons, it's relatively straightforward to keep other weapons caught up within striking distance of your main weapon. And if you were to decide today to shelf your main weapon and put all further AP gains into a brand new one that you've never touched or used, you'd be surprised at how quickly you actually work your way up through those traits and get to a point where your weapons are comparable. I think it was Ask Mr. Robot had a pretty good chart in a blog about this right before the expansion came out. I think it's still up there, just kind of showing the differences between someone who invests all their points into one weapon versus someone who splits them into between two or tries to keep the second at 80% of the first. It actually ends up being a difference of just a few days in terms of the progress of your main weapon in the long run. So I think that's the system that we envision being used for people who want to play multiple specs or switch between them, and not one that invites just pulling your power out and sticking it in another weapon and viewing it as that kind of transferable resource as opposed to a permanent choice that you're making along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think it's easy to look at, I spent all this time on my main weapon. I don't want to spend that amount of time again on my second weapon, but reality, you don't have to.
It's a fraction of the time, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of people, especially now, as you get to let's say you get to your second gold trait, your second gold border trait in your weapon, and you reach a point of somewhat diminishing returns, like the third trait may feel a bit out of reach for now, and your next couple of points are going to go into weaker minor traits. At that point, instead of getting those one or two weaker minor traits for your main weapon, you could get to that second gold border trait in a secondary or tertiary weapon relatively straightforwardly and quickly. And that power and that ability to switch between those specs may actually be a net power increase for your character if it lets you, be outlaw for the cleave heavy fight, but then switch to assassination or subtlety for the more single target heavy fight, for example.
Yeah, and I think that could actually, for people that like to play different specs, I think that can actually feel really good overall. Just because, like, I know in my case, there's a lot of times that I'm sitting there, I'm looking at world quests, I'm like, okay, I can get a couple thousand artifact power from this world quest, or sometimes it's around like 1k, 1.5k, whatever, just with where my artifact knowledge is right now. And I'm looking at that and going, maybe I'll wait until my artifact knowledge is higher level so that I'm getting more of this before I really start grinding that out. But then I think about it, I'm like, okay, yeah, but I could, like my frost artifact, I haven't put anything into that yet. I could get the first gold trait in that in a couple of hours tops.
Exactly.
Like, that would be super easy. Cool. Let's move on. Actually, talking about artifact knowledge here. A question from Feljuel. Feljuel? It's like casual but with fel, I guess.
Yep.
Says, is artifact knowledge working as hoped? Any plans to adjust research rates or make account/server wide?
Overall, I think we're actually pretty happy with how artifact knowledge and artifact progression are playing out. One of the design pillars that we had when we were approaching the system is that we didn't want to have a hard weekly cap. We didn't want to turn it into Mists of Pandaria Valor points, let's say, where it felt like your job every week was to get to 1,000 points. Once you did, there was no further reason or motivation to help your friend out in a dungeon run or what have you. And if you didn't hit that in a given week, it felt like you were falling behind. We wanted a sort of soft, flexible system that let people put in as much time as they wanted to put in, but had some diminishing returns so that the person who's playing a ton isn't actually that far ahead of the person who's playing an average amount, but they're getting something for their time invested. They always feel like they're moving forward towards their goals. So no regrets, no concerns there. In terms of alt catch-up or catch-up for latecomers, I think the research rates are the main knob there for now. If you're someone who hit max level within the first couple of days and started working on their artifact knowledge right away, you've had 5-day research times the whole way through. People who are a little bit behind are having 4-day research times, which will gradually close that gap. If you're, more than a couple weeks behind, you're going to start to see 3-day research times on those knowledge work orders that will get you caught up twice as fast, obviously. Now, in the long run, a couple months from now, when it's more common to be artifact knowledge level 15, 20 as the norm, we think we're going to need more drastic catch-up measures for people who are just getting started at that point. One option is something, like a special quest or one-time work order that could kind of jumpstart your knowledge level from 1 to 10, let's say. But that would be a longer-term thing. I think right now the system is playing out as hoped, but adjustments will be needed in the long run. We do want to make sure that alts and newcomers always feel like they can get into the game and be relevant and competitive.
That's cool. Yeah, like one concern I've had is that usually towards the end of an expansion is when I go, okay, time to finish getting all the rest of my characters up to max level and getting them all caught up. And if on every one of those it was like, and now I have to do, even if it's just like 3 weeks of research to get to that point, that would be kind of frustrating. So it's good to hear that that's something on the radar. Cool. Question here from Revenge Sir Alf, this is difficult to pronounce, I'll just put it on the screen, who asked, what is the logic behind gating some of the hidden artifact appearances behind massive RNG/time walls, while others are literally vendor items?
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think in general, when it comes to a lot of these things, whether it's class campaigns, whether it's artifacts, whether it's quest lines, we try to avoid a single formulaic approach. There were different goals for some of these. For example, for, I want to say, the Beastmaster Hunter hidden appearance that I think is just on a vendor, part of the reason for that is we wanted to give an upfront answer to people who are very uncomfortable with using a gun. We heard feedback from a lot of folks over the course of beta that they loved Beastmaster, wanted to play BM, loved the artifact system, did not want to use a gun. And we wanted to give them an option that was readily accessible for doing that. Now, the flip side there is there's no prestige in having that hidden appearance. It's not a rare thing. It's not something that people are necessarily excited to get.
Yeah.
If they wanted it, they bought it. Now it's done.
Yeah.
Versus, if you are farming the Thunder Fury variant on your Outlaw Rogue and you're doing repeated runs of Nelth's Lair and Vault of the Wardens, kind of reproducing that old school Molten Core feel, trying to get the bindings from Gar and Geddon,
right,
you're pretty excited when you get it. And when you see an Outlaw Rogue with those weapons, with that appearance, you're like, wow, that's cool. You don't see those all over the place. You know that person put in an unusual amount of time and effort in order to get it. So I think there's a couple, I definitely heard concerns about the Fury Warrior appearance in particular because of the way the world boss schedule works. That's a valid concern that we're definitely looking at to make sure it plays out in a fair way in the long run. But I think the inherent counterbalancing factor is the rarer it is, the harder to get it is, the more prestigious and the more valuable it is. If it's just on a vendor, if it's just handed to you, then it's not nearly as special.
Yeah, and speaking to that a little bit, I think there's actually a couple, I want to say Death Knights that haven't quite been figured out yet, like the actual process for getting those. The community, we the community, I don't know what they are, so we don't know what that, how to actually unlock those yet. And so while that's obviously can be frustrating for a lot of players right now, I feel like once those are figured out and once the code has been cracked, it's one of those things. It's like, okay, now this is like one of the most prestigious things that you can get.
It's been really fun to watch the community collect, whether it was figuring out Kasumoth at the start of the expansion, or
accidentally
puzzling over the riddle of how to unlock some of these hidden appearances and then excitedly sharing their knowledge. That's been a really cool process to see play out, and it really encourages us as a team to try to experiment more with that type of stuff, to try to have more hidden things that can be discovered, which are increasingly a challenge in this day and age of data mining. And in an ideal world, the way this discovery works isn't relying on script commands to check hidden quest flags and stuff like that, but it's more the in-world sense of discovery that the Kasumoth hunt, for example, unraveled. Yeah. But we will see.
Yeah, it's definitely been very cool. And hopefully we'll have more stuff like that in the future. All right. Asking about Karazhan here from, I think this is DeAndre, asked, will Karazhan also be an account-wide unlock?
I'm actually not sure off the top of my head how it is right now, but it feels like it should be. We'll definitely talk to the team about that. I think for all the reasons why we recently made or are making Arcway and Court of Stars, account-wide unlocks. I think the Attunement quest is there to put the story of Karazhan into some context and to make sure that people who are ready for that content are being led to it. Once you've done it on one character, it's not something that there's a ton of value to re-experience multiple times. So should be. Yeah,
you know what's going on in there at that point. You have demonstrated that you have the ability to unlock this content. It makes sense. Cool. Moving on. Question here from Kektonic, which, by the way, is an excellent name, who said, can we please get something other than gold for non-loot bonus rolls? Even a slight amount of artifact power would feel better.
It would. We would actually we'd love to give you artifact power. So this is actually an unfortunate technical limitation right now. The bonus roll system is something that we considered an experiment in Mists of Pandaria. We added it then. It's since kind of become a very institutionalized, ingrained part of how endgame loot in WoW works. But there were some restrictions kind of hard-coded into the system where the failure condition was gold. We'd like to offer other things, especially depending on context. That's something we're going to work towards. Requires some programming efforts to make happen. It sounds silly that it's not just a switch we can flip. I wish it were. But yes, we would like to offer AP. We realize that, when you're spending your bonus roll hoping for an awesome epic item, getting a few dozen gold does not feel particularly good. It feels more like an insult than a consolation prize, and we want it to feel like a consolation prize.
Cool. Okay. Sounds good. Question from Severa here, who asked, World Quests were supposed to have a large variety that we would not see many of them often, but I've found since launch we see many of the same ones repeated quite frequently. Is this going to be addressed?
What, you don't like catching squirrels? So yes. So there are a large variety of world quests, and actually, if you look at the map, you probably occasionally see some pop up that you've only seen once or so before. One of the issues that we've run into, which we're working on a UI solution for, as well as some technical solutions for, is that we currently don't handle overlapping world quests very well. And so our world quest handler, our scheduler that actually determines what's up, and when the 6-hour cycle comes around, determines which world quests are going to roll next, is actively trying to avoid overlaps. And so oftentimes, we try to prioritize world quests that haven't been seen frequently. So if the scheduler says, okay, this world quest hasn't been seen in 3 weeks, let's roll it. Oh, but wait, there's another world quest already active in this very same area. It gets overridden. And so it tries that again. And then eventually it falls back to world quests that have been seen more recently but don't have a conflict. And so the ones that you tend to see up the most often are the ones that are the only world quests that can roll in a specific area. So, for example, in the hub in Val'Sharah, the only possible world quest for that hub is nuts, catching squirrels and collecting acorns. It's not ideal, but that's why that one seems to pop up so much. Once we can better handle both UI-wise and gameplay-wise 2 overlapping world quests in the same location more frequently, we can remove that restriction, and you'll see a much more organic variation over time.
Okay, sounds good. So it's just something that we're working on.
Yes.
Cool. Question from Bozo on Twitter, who asked, lots of class balance issues with mechanics problems, for example, Balance Druid, impacting Raid and Mythic Plus desirability. What plans for 7.1?
I think in many ways this largely overlaps with the earlier question about sustained AoE. I think so balance-wise, numbers-wise, that's an ongoing process. We're definitely looking at those who are on the low end, and we'll continue to make adjustments to make sure that they're competitive. That said, there are different strengths and weaknesses. I think when you look at Balance Druid, for example, they have a lot of really solid utility in a variety of contexts. Things like Solar Beam, Typhoon are phenomenally useful in Mythic Plus dungeons, as cited here. When you're trying to help your tank kite away to reset their necrotic stacks, there's a lot of value there. Being able to Solar Beam a pack of imps in Court of Stars that's otherwise going to cast Drifting Embers and kill your raid while they're enraged, super useful. We'd rather continue to double down and focus on those sorts of mechanics, on the reasons that make you say, man, I really wish we had an X, or I'm really glad we have a Y here. And now I'm sure some people are saying, well, what happened to bring the player, not the class? I think in many ways, I think the game has actually drifted too far away from bring the class, and that bring the player can be taken to an extreme that can be harmful. I think when that statement was first made in 2008, it was against a backdrop of Burning Crusade Sunwell era raiding with party-specific buffs, where being a raid leader in Sunwell and just late Burning Crusade was about playing raid-class jigsaw puzzle, Tetris, whatever you want to call it. You needed a melee group, and in order to be viable, let's say a rogue, they needed a warrior giving them battle shout, or they were bad. The warrior, in order to not be terrible, needed a shaman dropping Wind Fury Totem, or they were bad. And so you'd find yourself often in a situation as a raid leader where you had 3 rogues who wanted to raid that night, but there were only 2 spots in the melee group, and a rogue not in the melee group was awful. You were better off bringing almost anything else, no matter how good a player they were, no matter how well geared they were. That was a problem. And that's really what led us down the road of, more of making buffs raid wide, of moving away from those sort of mandatory connections. But I think ideally the player base plays all different classes. We have 36 specs, 12 classes, a wide variety of players, and as we're constructing groups, whether they're 5-player groups, 10-player groups, 23-player groups, the player base as a whole, and I think the experience is best served if there's a reason to want some of everything. Obviously, you can have everything in a 5-player dungeon group or even in a 10-player raid, but being in a world where, as a pug leader, if you don't have any warlocks in your group, you're actively thinking like, all right, let's look for a warlock, not let's look for another ranged DPS. Because when it's just let's look for another ranged DPS, that boils down to, okay, who currently has the longest bar on Warcraft logs or whatever site you're looking at, that's who we want, versus, well, we want this utility, we want this unique benefit, we want, the thing that this class is going to bring, whether that is we want health stones, whether that is we want to have someone who can drop a gateway, whether it's we want someone who has an ability like deterrence or ice block to soak these abilities and let us perform a strat that's otherwise unconventional. The more the game can be in that place. Now, obviously, again, I realize I'm rambling a little bit here, but there's a fine line. We don't want you to be in a point where you're saying no skilled player / friend, you can't come because we already have too much of your class.
Yeah.
But if all else is equal and you're picking among a group of strangers, let's say you're a pug leader trying to fill your group, I think the game is better served, our class balance is better served, and the social community experience is better served if you're looking for the classes or specs that you don't already have represented in your group to fill out your ranks. We have a lot of work to do to get there, and the answer to a lot of those questions and goals is going to lie probably in introducing or reintroducing some new abilities that give utility, that give you synergies, and let you fill special roles. But that's, I think, our overall thinking and direction at this time.
Okay, cool. And so plans for 7.1, not much. This is much further down the line.
Exactly.
Cool. All right, we're actually over time, but we did have a bunch of issues earlier. So if you don't mind, I'd like to at least answer a couple more questions.
Absolutely, of course.
Okay, great, awesome. So question here from Nakes, who asked, with the higher maximum item level in Trial of Valor, will the maximum Mythic Plus item level you can reliably get also be increased?
No plans to do that right now, since it's just a 5 eye level bump for Trial of Valor, and the global ceiling still remains 895.
Okay.
When Nighthold comes out and overall better gear is available, that overall ceiling is raised. At that point, I think it needs to figure out the exact details, but almost certainly you'll start to be able to get better items from, let's say, Mythic 11, Mythic 12, Mythic 13, and the effective cap will go up a few tiers.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Let's see what we got next here. Question from Nerd Racer on Twitter, who asked, Ursoc's Rending Paw and several other Emerald Nightmare raid trinkets, are severely undertuned. Is this being looked into?
Yes. I think there's a lot of trinkets with a lot of varied and flavorful effects this time around. We have a ton of experience building passive stat, proc, crit, or, crit, proc, int type trinkets. Those are easy to make and balance. Much tougher and trickier to have, proc effects that actually move around in the area or have other more complex interactions. And it's easy to get the numbers wrong on those. And we're looking at what actual results are giving us data-wise, and we'll make some adjustments there.
Cool. Question here from Gravex. This is a good one, actually. I'm glad that we got to it. Asked, can you comment on the current state of Fury? Our single target damage isn't really competitive enough, given that we have the burden of 30% extra damage taken during Enrage.
Yes,
Seen a lot of Fury warriors asking about this.
Yep. Okay, so we have some improvements for Fury coming in 7.1. It just numbers tweaks, increasing their overall damage across the board. We're also taking the damage penalty from Enrage down from 30% to 20%. I think Warpaint will reduce it to 15% in that world. We definitely heard the feedback, and admittedly, this was feedback we heard throughout beta. I think there's a good case to be made that we should have listened then, but better late than never. The 30% extra damage taken, or the extra damage taken from Enrage, understandably can be frustrating. I think psychologically, it's out of your control. It's something that you proc. It's an effect that is theoretically making you better and fueling your abilities in some ways, but inevitably, you're going to die to a Cacophonic Roar on Ursoc or to some other spike of damage, look at your death log and notice, oh, you gained Enrage 1 second before this thing went out. I died because of that. That's unfortunate. So I think we see the 7.1 changes as a little bit of a Band-Aid. We want to make that issue less serious, but I think in the longer term, the answer is likely some redesign there to find a different way to refocus that berserker fantasy of throwing caution to the winds and recklessly, as it were, charging into battle, doing extra damage, but taking more damage in the process. I think there's some other roads we could take there.
Okay, cool. Still want to keep the general feeling of I'm going to give up some defense in order to do more damage.
But I think having control over it would help a lot.
That would be really cool. Yeah. All right. Let's do one more question, possibly two more questions, actually. This question comes from the People's Feral, who asked, why must relics be destroyed? Very easy to mess up if you're not up to speed on theorycraft or you get bad advice.
I think, unlike a lot of our other unlike a lot of our other items, rather, with relics, item level, by and large, is the king because of how important weapon DPS and weapon stats are. There have been a couple of outliers where certain traits are incredibly powerful. We've actually adjusted some of those traits, like the tactician modifying trait on the arms artifact that was dominating item level. So in general, you should feel like you can trust higher item level on those. In terms of why they're destroyed, I think the alternative would be inventories and bags just full of dozens of different relics and turning them into a really complex, awkward third or fourth talent system where you're swapping things around, except you're swapping them around by opening this interface and digging through your bags and picking what to socket where. There's plenty of systems that try to serve that, whether it's picking your spec, picking your talents. Relics are really meant to be a more permanent decision, but no matter what you choose there, you're going to get an upgrade in the long term. You're going to replace it with something or other regardless. So if you're not sure right away, you can keep it in your bags for a while, decide whether you want to use it, but once you use it, just onwards and forwards from there.
Okay, cool. All right, one last question for you. We've been talking a lot about stuff coming in patch 7.1 and lots of improvements that are coming there and lots of new content and going on there as well. So I picked out one last question that I wanted to make sure that we absolutely got to, which comes from George Mihailov, who said, patch 7.1 release date.
Well, I mean, as soon as it's ready, right? I think a hallmark of Blizzard design values are that we're never going to rush anything. We want to make sure that the content is going to be as close to perfect as it can be before it goes out into players' hands.
Right.
And as a result, we can never really commit to patch dates because, who knows what could happen. We might not be satisfied. So generally, we just say soon, sometimes soon TM.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, and in this case, actually, the patch is pretty close to ready. So October 25th. How about that? How about really soon? I know a lot of people were sitting around saying, oh, this is going to be an after BlizzCon patch. This is going to be December, maybe. No, it's actually less than 2 weeks away. So current plan there is October 25th, the week of October 25th, depending on your region, obviously, will be the 26th if you're in Europe.
Right.
Patch 7.1 will go live. You'll be able to jump right into the Mythic Dungeon Return to Karazhan with 8 bosses, mysteries, and epic challenges there.
Nice.
You can continue the Suramar quest campaign. Now, the Trial of Valor raid will not be open day 1. Our current plan is to open that 2 weeks after the patch releases, so after the week of BlizzCon for a couple of reasons. Obviously, for a competitive guild perspective, no one wants to be doing progress during BlizzCon.
Right.
But also from a company World of Warcraft team perspective, BlizzCon just kind of takes the whole team down for a week, and
we're kind of at the Anaheim Convention Center for
exactly
most of that.
The general bug fixing and oversight and tuning that goes
Right.
into releasing a new raid tier is not something that can really happen during BlizzCon. Plus, honestly, almost everybody, as I just said earlier, with the exception of a few dozen guilds, people are still working their way through ML Nightmare.
Yeah.
We don't see a need to rush that out, so that will be second week of November for Trial of Valor. But yeah, so. Awesome. All of those class changes, quality of life improvements, Blood of Sargeras vendor, all of that stuff that we've talked about, that will be in your hands very, very soon, probably sooner than you thought.
No TM.
No TM.
Soon,
just
TM.
Legitimately 25th.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being here, Ian. Again, apologies for the technical issues we had earlier, but I'm glad that we were able to get through so many questions regardless. Congratulations again on
Thank you.
Game Director. That is awesome. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in as well.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure as always.
Yep. Be sure to check out BlizzCon. We're going to have a lot of stuff available, especially if you pick up that virtual ticket that you'll be able to watch online for BlizzCon as well. We don't have our next live Q&A here planned out just yet, but as soon as we do, we will share that information. There will be more. It's just a question of exactly when that's going
And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions coming out of BlizzCon because there's always fun news that comes out of BlizzCon that leads to questions.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.